Hello, everyone. If you've joined us this evening for AAUW session with Dr. Marjorie Spruill, my name is Kim Churches, and I'm the CEO of AAUW. Thanks so much for joining us. So for many of our AAUW members and activists around the country, this really rings true, tonight's conversation with Dr. Spruill, and I'm so glad she could join us. Because throughout the history of AAUW, our members and activists have been right on the front lines on gender equity issues, and definitely were on the front lines in the 1970s when the women's movement was really breaking barriers. In fact, the 1971-72 Congress passed more women's rights bills than all previous legislative sessions combined, which is pretty stellar. And that includes the Title IX Amendment. As you think ahead to that, the 1972 Supreme Court case, Eisenstadt versus Baird, gave unmarried women legal access to birth control. And of course, we know in 1973, Roe v. Wade made abortion legal across the country. So as we talk through this, we also find there are times through this period where we saw Republicans and Democrats working together. Now imagine that as we look at where we are here today in 2020 and seeing how we could see Republicans and Democrats working together and agreeing on women's rights. So I'm going to dig in on a few questions, but first let me introduce our special guest this evening, Dr. Marjorie Spruill, who's with us from beautiful South Carolina. Marjorie is Distinguished Professor Emerita of the University of South Carolina. Her areas of expertise include women's and gender history, American political history, and the history of the U.S. South. She's very much known for her work on women's movements in the United States, and for the centennial of the 19th Amendment, she published a revised and expanded edition of the anthology, One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement, that she edited to accompany the PBS American Experience film, One Woman, One Vote. Her most recent book that I really encourage you to read if you have not already is Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics. And in the book, it considers the rise of the modern women's rights movement in the late 60s and 70s, the mobilization of social conservatives as the kind of, quote, pro-family movement, and the conflicts between these two movements, which contributed to the transformation of American political culture and led to the highly partisan and polarized political culture from then and very much so to today. So Marjorie, let me first just say welcome and thank you again so much for joining us. I have to add, you know, before we get started on the first question, how proud we are because you're also an alumna of AAUW, having received an AAUW American Fellowship. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I have to start by thanking you because without that fellowship, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I wouldn't have gotten my degree. I wouldn't have had my career. I was a young mother with a new baby when I got that fellowship. A fellowship that, I don't know if anyone out there is living in Mississippi, but that the AAUW in Mississippi raised the money for that fellowship. And it just made all the difference. So whenever you're thinking about that program, please know what a huge difference it makes to scholars at very crucial times.
Thank you, Marjorie. And we feel the same. It is something that we're so proud that will be a legacy for decades and decades to come. And I have the great privilege and honor of meeting incredible humans like you who have benefited from it and then have then paid it forward by producing such important work. So thank you for being with us.
And if you would bear with me 1 minute, I'd also like to say that my fellowship was named after Judge Lucy Somerville Howarth, a distinguished AAUW member who lived to be 102 after a brilliant career beginning as a suffragist, becoming a federal judge under Roosevelt, and just giving me all kinds of advice and help as a mentor when I was first starting out, but most of all that fellowship that they raised in her honor. So,
oh, Marjorie, I mean, I didn't know all of that history, so that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, really. Well, help us to kind of set the stage for this evening's conversation. You can talk a little bit about the federally sponsored International Women's Year Conferences of 1977. That was a really important time and a pretty big deal. What was the goal, and why were these sets of discussions so important?
The goal of the whole thing was to involve women of the United States in deciding future federal policy. And it all began as part of a United Nations sponsored effort to try to promote women's rights all around the world. And the US conference, the one in the National Women's Conference in Houston that we'll be talking about, came shortly after the United States sent delegates to Mexico City to the International Women's Year Conference sponsored by the UN in 1975. And at that conference, these delegates from all over the world adopted what they called a world plan of action about trying to improve women's lives in every country and get them more involved in the economy and have them part of the peace process. And it sparked the growth of an international feminist movement. But in the United States, what happened is that the delegates from our country, including Congresswoman Bella Abzug of New York, came back and realized that what they wanted to see happen was for women all over the country to have that kind of inspirational experience that they had in Mexico City. And they wanted them to come together and discuss the issues and play a role in this, rather than have it just be a commission appointed by the president that would be making these recommendations. And I also think that they had a sort of covert agenda, which was to help spread the women's rights movement all over the country. And certainly that was the dream, that was the plan, and I think it had that effect. But it also had another effect, which was to stir up conservative women who were already very upset about these raft of gains that the women's rights movement had made early in the 70s, and particularly the Equal Rights Amendment, which they had organized to fight. And they saw this as an effort to just cram the ERA through when it was in trouble. They felt like that by 1975 that they had stopped it, and that even then President Ford and Congress agreed to the recommendations of Bella Abzug and Congresswoman Patsy Mink and others to have Congress fund this National Women's Conference, and first a series of state meetings where people would come together in every state and debate the issues, adopt resolutions, and elect delegates to go on to Houston. So it ended up having multiple effects, and some of them unintended.
Yeah, I'm sure. And, you know, as we think about this, as that national plan of action was produced and all of these unintended results here, to conservatives, how radical really was the document? And to radicals, how conservative did it feel for them? I mean, there's this push-pull is a real deal in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the main impetus behind the whole scene came more from pragmatic feminist, moderate feminist women who were either in elected office or working for the government or serving on the commissions on women that had come earlier. And they, even some of them were somewhat radical, but they definitely believed in working within the system and in trying to do more to get women more political power. Some of them were more radical, even Gloria Steinem, who kind of saw it as a major concession just to cooperate with the government in this way. And then on the other hand, you had Phyllis Schlafly and others who were doing everything in their power, first to try to stop this whole thing from happening, and then once it did happen, to get as many of the conservative women as possible to challenge feminists for control of these. I should add that you mentioned earlier that in the early 70s that there was a lot of support for the women's movement in both the Democratic and Republican parties. And so first President Ford, and then after he was defeated, Jimmy Carter appointed the leaders of this national commission who were going to organize these conferences. And they appointed feminists in their respective parties. They did not appoint any of the conservatives, and the conservatives were furious. So they managed to get their allies in Congress. And by 1975, they had some, such as Jesse Helms. They managed to get the budget for this whole thing cut in half from what was requested, but they didn't get it blocked. Then they tried to block it in the courts, did not succeed there. And so in January of, in early spring of 1977, they created something called the IWY, that's International Women's Year, Citizens Review Committee. And the whole purpose of that was to organize to get as many conservative women as possible to attend the meetings in each state and to try to outvote the feminists on both the resolutions and the delegates.
Wow.
And then they were not successful in, they sort of got started a bit late. They weren't in control of the meetings. As the summer went on, as I say in the book, this incredible summer, and I believe I call the chapters things like Armageddon state by state. Mama said there'd be days like this, and out of the kitchens and into the counter-revolution. These are the chapter titles of these ones about the states. And I feel like that these state meetings were super important. And as the feminists were winning pretty much all of them in the early summer, the middle of the summer, it was more mixed. By the end of the summer, they were sweeping, the conservatives were sweeping these things. But even so, with their late start, they only succeeded in getting about 20% of the delegates. So when you got to Houston and voted on the National Plan of Action, it was definitely a feminist document. They were able to have almost no impact on it. And so afterwards, when they were very, shall we say, inspired by the experience that they had working together, building this massive coalition to challenge feminists, to show that and then of course had this massive rally in Houston called the Pro-Life, Pro-Family Rally, where they came in busloads all over the country in huge numbers down to the Astro Arena and held an afternoon of speeches in which they made it very clear to the press and to the public and to the politicians that the women in the National Women's Conference were not speaking for them. They also were inspired looking around and seeing how many of them had shown up. And their orators reminded them that if they all stuck together, if they remained active in politics, that they could make a huge difference. And they kind of made this vow to take their country back from the liberals and the moderates that they believed had been ruining the country and definitely catering too much to the feminists. And so then they did everything in their power to try to mobilize even more conservatives, to register them to vote, and to vote out a lot of the people who had been the chief allies of the feminists. To get back to your question, one of the main ways they did that was to hold up that National Plan of Action and say to people, this is what the feminists want. You know, they may say that the ERA didn't have anything to do with abortion. They may say that they are not advocates of gay rights, but look at this document. This document shows that all of these things are their goals. They can't divide them. They can't say they're not for them. And this is what you would get if you were if you don't do something to stop their rise.
Wow. You know, and what I'm going to do is segue a little bit into Phyllis Schlafly here and see if we can, you know, talk about what impact this time period has had on where we are today. But before we do, you know, the civil rights movement was just a decade prior to this. And so I'd be interested in taking on your, you know, we know what roles women of color played in the suffrage movement. We know what women of color were working towards as well in terms of their own human rights as well. But can you talk a little bit about whether the conference addressed minority rights, how the conservatives and liberals played into that at the time, particularly because it was only a decade after the Civil War.
Yeah, it was. This is a huge part of my book because the leaders of this International Women's Year program, including the state meetings and the National Plan of Action, doing something to be sure that the women's movement attracted large numbers of minority women and did things to meet their needs, to pay attention to their needs, to have them be there to identify their needs and press for them. That was hugely important, was one of their main goals. And right from the beginning, they took steps to make that happen. First of all, when it came to appointing the organizers for the state meetings all across the country, they didn't just allow the governors to appoint the people the way it had been done for the state commissions on the status of women. They appointed them. And one of the reasons they did this was because in the 60s, in the Deep South especially, minority women were left out. That was at the height of the civil rights, the mass movement, for voting rights and civil rights. And these white Southern governors were appointing all white members to these women's commissions, including some of the leading racists in the state, who, by the way, were part of the effort later to defeat the ERA and to fight feminists for control of these conferences. I have to tell you that the way I got to this topic in the first place was that, again, at the time that I was this young mother, moved to Mississippi and starting out my career, at that time I was writing only about women's suffrage. But every feminist that I kept meeting in the state, including one of your leading AAUW members named Dr. Cora Norman. She was the head of the Mississippi Humanities Council and just a fabulous person and a great mentor for me. I believe she ran for president of the AAUW at one time. She and others started telling me about the Mississippi takeover, the takeover by these arch conservatives, including white nationalists and Klansmen, of that state meeting in Mississippi. And I just was, wow. And that was my first time that I got interested in this whole thing. And then I began to research the entire program, and it grew and grew and grew. And this book actually started with Mississippi and the Mississippi takeover, and then went on to become this study of the IWI conferences in general, and of the rise of the women's rights movement, the rise of the conservative opposition, how they became, the tensions between them increased as a result of these IWI meetings, and the women of the country became more polarized, and then really charged up both sides afterwards between these conferences in 1980. And then, of course, in 1980, the conservatives played a major role in getting Ronald Reagan nominated, and the feminists were virtually driven out or alienated from the Republican Party as it ended its 40-year record of support for the Equal Rights Amendment and declared itself the party of life and of family values. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party continued to support the women's movement and the civil rights movement, and increasingly so the gay rights movement. And sort of all of that together, I believe, sort of became the modern Democratic Party. And so my major argument there is that from 1980 to the present, that those trends continued. The book ends with a chapter called A Nation Divided, in which you trace how these tensions that divided women in the 1970s then continued to divide and polarize the whole country. And I take it all the way through the 80s, 90s, and on all the way up to the 2016 presidential election where the book ends.
Yeah, and that I really remember. And it's you know, as we're all watching the Hulu Mrs. America series now, and watching this play out, and as we in your book, so it's like you're reading a movie, although so many of us lived through all of this and know how polarized this movement has become over the decades. You know, how do you think about it today after, you know, closing the book at the end of the 2016 election, and now where we are today? How do you think all of this emboldened movements on both sides have where is it playing out to where we are today to you?
Well, the conservative women's movement and the feminist movement, neither of them ended in 1980. I'm always amazed when people say things like, oh, well, when did second wave feminism end? And I'm going, it ended? You know, I haven't heard. It's still going on as far as I'm concerned, and still winning, you know. The conservative women's movement was very successful in a couple of things. One, and in eating into and limiting the reproductive rights of women that had been gained during the 70s. They were not able so far to get rid of Roe v. Wade, but they certainly were able to do things to restrict. And Schlafly and others really targeted from 1980 on the judiciary. In 1980, the Republican Party platform also included having a pro-life position to be a litmus test for the appointment of judges. They began sort of trying to get people in the pipelines so that as they gained power that they could have judges that would be more conservative on abortion. And we have seen the results. The other thing they did, which was a temporary victory, was to demonize the word feminist and to make many people who believe firmly in the goals of the feminist movement reluctant to call themselves feminist. That, I am pleased to say, is over. The feminism is cool, in case nobody's noticed. You can ask everyone from Emma Thompson to Beyonce to Emma Watson. That's who I'm trying to think of. It's you know, a whole different world. And of course, after the 2016 election, a lot of people who I believe, particularly young women who had grown up, come of age politically during the presidency of the most feminist president we had ever had, Barack Obama, I think a lot of them felt like that there really wasn't a need for them to pay as much attention to it anymore. And so 2016 was a shock to them along with the rest of the world. And everybody took to the streets. They also took to the ballot box. And in the 2018 elections, women not only turned out to vote in record numbers, but they also ran for office in record numbers. And they supported each other more than they ever had before. They opened their wallets. What I've been reading from political scientists and strategists and analysts is that this has only increased since 2018, and that women are going to decide this 2020 presidential election.
Yeah, I think that's really really an important statement there of how we've grown, and that word feminism of being a good old-fashioned F word for so long is turning. I will say, and you know this very well, AAUW has been fiercely nonpartisan since the very beginning of our roots in the 18th. And that's really because this is just pragmatically what makes sense with half the population, to make sure that women can achieve their full selves, support their families, support themselves. And it's really interesting as we do work in red, blue, and purple parts of the country with our research, with our advocacy efforts, and with our programs, that when we go in and more approach in more conservative areas of the country, more with listening ears as to what appointed and elected officials need and are seeing from their constituents on the ground, we can meet them where they are to say, this is about half of your population. really being able to strive going forward. And it's unfortunate that for so long, feminism, women's rights were seen as purely the interests of liberal women or the Democratic Party. And it's amazing to me, really, in listening to you and having read your book now twice, as as we think back to this time, which is not so long ago, of when we actually saw both parties, both strong parties in this nation supporting women's rights, and how divided we've become, how we can get to a place again, perhaps in this election cycle, or I hope in the very near future, where we all can be using the same, nouns, adjectives, and verbs to describe what we like in a way that can bring the parties together rather than this vitriolic attack. Do you see, given what you just said about post 2016 to where we are today, do you see that as a potential? And do you think, Marjorie, that given this horrific pandemic that not just our nation, but the entire globe is facing, that there's any reason for hope in how we can work together in terms of equity in education, equity in work, and equity in communities?
I certainly hope so. And I would love to see this be, as you said, a much more bipartisan effort, the way it was in the 70s. I mean, all these gains that made such a difference in our lives are the result of the fact that the two parties were both behind the women's movement at that time. And I'm hoping that people, regardless of their party affiliations, are going to have their consciousness raised, shall we say, about the importance of people who are the essential workers, about the importance of teachers. I mean, it's become it's being said just all the time now, often on the comedy shows and in the political cartoons, about how anyone who didn't believe that teachers needed a raise has now changed their mind. Certainly the people in a profession, nursing, that has been traditionally women, though we are seeing lots and lots of men in it now, everyone is recognizing how crucial they are, and they are the heroes and heroines of the story. And the other thing that's interesting, flexible work, that people are learning that this can be done, that this is effective. And so hopefully that will make a difference. I'd like to think that one of the things we didn't win in the 70s, which was a government-supported childcare program that went all the way down to several years younger than the kindergartens now begin, and then goes, excuse me, I'm getting getting mixed up here. We did not get childcare programs as part of the 70s. It was passed by both houses of Congress, and then there was a major objection that I describe in the book to it, again led by conservative women, and it led to Richard Nixon vetoing it. And all of these many years since then, conservative women's organizations, including the Eagle Forum, they support lots of things that they think are going to help make families stronger, but have been very hostile to the idea of government-supported childcare. I am hoping that maybe that's an idea that's time has come, and that people are really going to see a need for it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. We spoke with Dr. Caitlin Collins last week about this issue and how she studied childcare policy, of it not being tied to your childcare and paid leave not being tied to your employment, but just being your right as a citizen, as you see so often in tens and 140 countries around the globe, and what that potential would be like for us, given that women now make up half the labor force as well. Women make up the majority of part-time workers. Women make up the majority of low-skilled, low-wage workers, which all happen to be essential workers workers and essential work that allows a lot of men and women to go to work. So I tend to agree with you that that's a real opportunity for us moving forward. I'm going to remind everybody who's on this terrific conversation with us this evening with Dr. Marjorie Spruill a couple things. One, we are taping this and it will be available for those who weren't able to join us tonight on the www.aauw.org website. Furthermore, if you have a question, a substantive question about what we're discussing tonight, please post that in the Q&A section. And Marjorie, if you're okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn to that now and just take a look here at a couple of the questions. And this is where I'm a woman of a certain age where sometimes the glasses need to be on and off. So let me see if I can read.
Okay.
Let's see here. Oh, this is, yeah, well, Marcy writes in, you know, as a reminder to everybody, women could not get credit cards in their own name in the 1970s, nor could we either have our own mortgage, something that young women can't believe today. And I think that's particularly important as we think about this generational gap. You know, we essentially have 5 generations of women that can and are in the workforce right now, but their sense of understanding history may be a little opaque. And so the clarity that you provide in your book there is important, that this isn't that long ago of some of these fights, really.
Excuse me.
Let's see here. Now, this is something that really gets to the divides that you're talking about in your book. Gloria writes in, I consider myself both a feminist and pro-life. ERA includes equal rights for the unborn. It upsets me that dialogue cannot take place in a peaceful manner. By the way, I'm also a minority woman. Talk about that a little bit, about, you know, from your findings and from your research and your work on the book of how, you know, how we can get to a place where we can all take a breath and respect one another as women. Also add on, because she's bringing in both race and ethnicity, as well as religious beliefs. You know, I think something that we've seen at AAUW as we've been working on our strategic plan, and as we've been particularly hosting focus groups with millennials and Generation Z, of the interest of inclusion, diversity, and intersectionality. So is there a time here, Marjorie, where we can all take a breath and perhaps get rid of the vitriol, do you see, to find some common ground and have a peaceful conversation, as Gloria suggests?
Well, I certainly hope so. And if it's going to happen, I think it's going to be women who lead the way. Certainly that's what happened in Congress. There are women who work together across party lines a lot more than the men have, it seems. There have been the number of instances from the 90s on in which women who are part of the sort of women's caucus within Congress have broken these impasses that have led to government shutdowns and have worked together in meaningful ways. The abortion issue has become just a major sticking point, one of the most difficult issues in our national political scene. I think it has a great deal to do with the extent of the polarization and the bitterness, because it's an issue that people don't want to compromise about, that they believe that if they do compromise, that they are doing something immoral. Because Nellie Gray, who was the woman who founded the March for Life, and was one of the organizers of the pro-life, pro-family meeting in Houston, she was contemptuous when Gerald Ford tried to take a moderate position on abortion. And she said, so what is a moderate position on it's a half killing a baby, or, you know, you just can't do that. So one of my arguments in the book is that the issue of abortion during the 70s became a issue that the parties were divided over. But in the early 70s, it was not that case. And you found people who were Republicans and Democrats on each side of the issue. For example, Sergeant Shriver, who ended up running vice president, he and most of the Kennedys were strongly pro-life. They were Catholics, and that mattered very much to them. On the other hand, you have in the Republican Party Barry Goldwater, who was more pro-choice. He wouldn't have used those words, but he didn't think that ought to be, that abortion should be illegal. And then in 1976, the Republican Party began to move in that direction on the urging of Schlafly and others, but they didn't take as strong a position. And but it wasn't until 1980 that the two parties lined up on opposite sides of that issues. And one of my key points in the book is that 1977 was one of the big things about it was the coming together of the anti-ERA and the pro-life movements as allies against the feminists, as the feminists put themselves behind this national plan of action that included support for abortion rights as well as the ERA. So there was this, that's what polarizing is all about, of course. The meaning of the word is that people tend to gather at both ends, and that adage that we started to hear about with the wars in the Middle East, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is what happened. And so what happens from 1980 on is that politics, women and also women's issues began to be permanently at the top of the political agenda, the center of the conversation, and that as issues about which people have very strong moral or religious convictions rise to the top of the political debates, that the compromise becomes almost impossible. People who are in elected office would find that their constituents won't tolerate it. And so when you have the country more and more polarized over that issue, and then the two parties divide up, that's how you have the bitter polarization and partisanship that has really marked our political culture from that time on. So it's abortion is hugely important, and it's important to every woman, every human being. And it is a very difficult issue for people to talk about calmly and rationally, because it just matters so much.
Yeah, it really does. And as we're even seeing in this era that we're living in right now with COVID-19, of some who've kind of dismissed, well, you know, if some people who are over the age of 80 have to die in order for us to get this economy, I mean, you just go, whoa, how are we not valuing all lives again? It's stunning. And you're right. These are topics that it's hard for us as human beings who, even as we're trying to activate our brains, that our hearts and our souls and our belief system cloud our ability to have really productive dialogues. I've got one that I think you're going to really appreciate here from Katie that says, I'm a transplanted Alabamian to Chicago. What is your view on Southern women's mentality today? Do you believe are younger women leaning more toward conservatism or liberalism? And by the way, it's just heavenly to hear a fellow Southern accent.
Yes. It's interesting. A friend of mine who's a political scientist at the University of Arkansas named Angie Maxwell has written a book very recently called The Long Southern Strategy. And she kind of agrees with me about an argument I make in the book, and that is that in the 1970s, as it became more politically unacceptable to be overtly racist, that what happened is a lot of the people who were looking for coded language began to find that being overtly anti-feminist was okay, was tolerated, and that became the new Southern strategy, and that lots of people were as a lot of Democrats were in the South were disaffected from their party in part because of its support for the civil rights movement. And some of the more conservative Republicans were, as they say, hunting where the ducks are, as trying to gain more supporters in the South. One of the ways they did that, was by exploiting this issue. And that, again, is a major theme. And Angie really takes this and runs with it and shows what has happened. And one of the things that she points out that I don't think very many people realize is that the gender gap, which has been favoring Democrats since 1980, it is also related to intersectionality, as you mentioned. More women of color are the ones who tend to favor the Democrats overwhelmingly. I think everyone probably knows that listening out there, and that more white married women have tended to favor the Republicans. And there was much said about Hillary Clinton and how she didn't carry the white women's vote. And in fact, she carried the women's vote with the aid of women of color, but she also carried the white women's vote if you are talking about outside the South. And the fact that she lost the white women's vote is the result of overwhelming support for the Republican Party among women in the southern states. So these, region, race is, it's very much a part of what we have to look at if we're going to understand anything about gender in politics.
Yeah, it really, all of these things, that's why, looking at all of those various geography, upbringing, values, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and class, so much of this plays into all of this, of our current divides.
And one of the things that was another point I made about the International Women's Year was that there was a requirement that every one of the delegations that went to the National Convention had to represent the racial and ethnic diversity of their state, as well as occupational diversity, income diversity. And so that was insisted upon, that was fundamental. That's why when Mississippi elected this all-white group, it was challenged at the National Convention. But one of the things that happened is that at these meetings, such as the one in Mississippi and in Florida, and the Klansmen were even showing up and trying to infiltrate these meetings, encouraging, quote, their women to turn out and vote. That was Robert Shelton, who was this horrible Klansman from Alabama, actually went to Houston and said he was there to protect their women from the radical lesbians, which is just unbelievable. Just unpack that. What happened is that Barbara Jordan was asked to be one of the major keynote speakers. Coretta Scott King was there and on the stage, on the platform, along with the three first ladies. I was saying that you had two former first ladies, one current first lady, and the first lady of the civil rights movement. They were all there together, plus Maya Angelou, who wrote a special poem for the occasion and was one of the commissioners who was appointed to organize this whole thing. And so a lot of the conservative women believed that, really resented the fact that their leaders like Schlafly were not appointed to be on any of these organizing groups, while they saw women of color there in such large numbers and in such positions of honor on the stage. And so, it was really something. But the mood of most of the feminist delegates there was just profoundly in favor of harmony between Black and white women and other women of color. In fact, one of the points I make in the book is that it was during a meeting of women who were from many minority groups that the term women of color was coined at that session. And then when they finished with their recommendations and they brought them to the floor for everyone to consider and vote on, Coretta Scott King led the way by making this statement that let the word go forth from Houston that we are united and that we will never be divided again. And then everyone spontaneously took hands and began to sing, "We Shall Overcome." And people were just standing there with weeping, with tears. And it just was one of what most people there said that was the most emotionally charged moment of the whole thing for them. Some of the people in the audience today are like me, are old enough to have been fans of Edith Bunker. And Edith was there. Jean Stapleton was there. She was one of the commissioners. And she was saying, she said, I never had a sister. I never wanted a sister. But here in Houston, I have 20,000 sisters. And she, it was just a super powerful moment, and a moment of harmony that a lot of people took with them.
Powerful indeed. Marjorie, I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight. I could talk with you for hours about this.
My pleasure.
Also being a part of our AAUW family has meant so much. I've got one final one from Carol here. And then again, a reminder to everybody, if we didn't get to your questions, one, I want to encourage you to pick up the book of Marjorie's if you have not yet. As I said, I've read it twice. Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics. But this last one is really taking us back to modern day here. And Carol writes, really, as we think about this through this new demographic lens of where the United States, how it's looking and changing every day as a nation in terms of majority and minority, in terms of gender fluidity, et cetera. So Carol writes, do you think because there is such a large contingent of younger voters who do not identify with party politics, and with that I know she's meaning the two parties, that perhaps this younger generation, younger voters may play the bridge between the parties?
I think that's an excellent point, and I really hope that happens. People who are not carrying around this baggage from the past that can be open to each other, can have more discourse. I'd love to see that happen.
Well, Marjorie, thank you so much. I wish I could join you and your husband for a gin and tonic there in South Carolina. It's been my honor and privilege to spend time with you tonight. I know everyone on tonight's webinar enjoyed it as well. And as I said in the beginning, past is prologue, my friends. We've seen this play out, and it's so important for us to remember why we are where we are today. And enormous thanks to Dr. Marjorie Spruill for being with us tonight, for sharing her insights and thoughts. Marjorie, thank you.
It was a pleasure. And again, thanks for all you've done for me.
You stay safe and be well. Take care.
Thank you.